the TLDR of this session was, is there any early signals? What are some early experiments of using AI in recognition that we can showcase to trigger a conversation? All right? So to do that, we invited a panel of people that have actually gotten their hands dirty around it, particularly through a significant experience called Experience U that was supported and started by the T3 Innovation Network. And so we have Jason, who you've met earlier here, to give us a bit of high-level framing. Phil, who's been very, very involved in leading this work, and Julie, who's actually participated in one of these experiments. And by the way, we should have had another panelist, Chris, but he's unfortunately fallen sick, so he's not here with us. All right? Full of wonders. So we're going to go in this order. Jason, Phil, and Julie, I'm going to ask you to just do 5 minutes sprint first, right? And then we can go back and deep dive a little bit more. We do have an hour, so I think fortunately we have enough time to trigger you and ask some further questions. Okay? All right, so I'm going to hand over the mic.
Thank you, Simone. So what I'm hoping to do with my brief remarks up front is just provide a little history and context for this particular initiative. So as Simone had mentioned, this was a project under the T3 Innovation Network. And as I previously presented, T3 has been involved in a wide variety of LER supporting activities, learning and employment records. And one of the things that always kind of chafed me in a lot of the T3 discussions was that there was still kind of this overwhelming participation on the side of more traditional education partners in the LER conversation. That makes total sense. But it was more of a minority of voices on the employer side and other places, and that's where the chamber's trying to lead in to kind of bring that business voice forward. But the one thing that always was kind of troubling me was, we're not going to change practice at scale unless we're going to have LERs at scale. So how are we going to produce more of these records faster that would actually cause HR units inside companies to change their business practices and technology? We've been using a variety of technologies for a long time. They're imperfect, but they work. And I think everyone here probably could have appreciation that it's very hard to do change management. And if you don't have a critical mass of these records or verifiable credentials out there, employers aren't going to change their practice in terms of a skills-based hiring use case, for example. So how do you create enough volume to catalyze change on the change management side of things? So that was one of the problems we were looking at is, we can't do dozens or hundreds of records. We need tens of thousands, if not millions, if not tens of millions of records. How are we going to do that? So that was one thing that kind of stood out to us, is this is going to be boutique unless we come up with some shortcuts to create more volume faster. The other issue that was really chafing us was this issue around, okay, and I'm going to say this facetiously, do we need more MIT graduates, sorry MIT, running around with a new type of record? Or, we talk a big game about equity, but at the end of the day, who are going to be the folks initially receiving these records, and is it going to be the haves and not the have-nots? So if we mean what we say about all learning counts and we want to empower all learners and workers with better data, how do we better start with those populations that currently aren't really at the table or part of the discussion? They're not hanging out in the universities and colleges where most of the conversation is taking place. Again, nothing against college and universities. So Experience U is kind of a product of those two issues. How do we get to scale faster and cheaper? And how are we making sure LERs become accessible to all, and this doesn't just become another university technology or product? Again, nothing wrong with that, but how are we broadening that aperture from day one? So the third rail in this, for me personally, is I like to jokingly say to our LER friends in the T3 network, I say, this is all fine and good, but what about Jason? What about me? Nobody's issuing anything to me anytime soon, although I know Nate wants to issue me something and stuff. But I've got my credentials. I'm busy. I'm going to be doing this for a while. And if the LER movement isn't relevant to people like me earlier, it's not going to be relevant to a huge section of the workforce. And how are you kind of meeting the workforce where they're at today, leaving nobody behind and making sure everybody, and I do mean everybody, can participate in LERs? So how do we solve the Jason problem? We got a lot of people that already have experience, already have credentials. Why should they care when I'm probably just going to put together a traditional resume for whatever I'm going to do next? So we're trying to kind of work across those three rails, and the end product was this initiative that was hosted by the T3 Innovation Network, and I came up with Experience You as kind of just a bit of a tongue-in-cheek name. But it was this idea of how do we bring, we talk about badging and credentialing mostly in the context of like things we're doing now. Like I'm going to participate in this conference and maybe get a badge. I'm going to go complete a program, maybe get a verifiable credential. But what about the past? And if we want to make it relevant to the vast majority of the workforce who's already been working and earning, we need to bring their past forward. So that was the idea behind Experience You, is can we look at the LER space very differently, not as this is how we credential differently going forward, but we can credential the past. And we thought the best way to do that is to look at where artificial intelligence could play a role and saying, let AI help somebody better tell their story about their past education and workforce experiences. And can it be done? And can it be done well? Not to say it's going to solve it on day one, but can AI provide an assistance to say, based upon the artifacts and information you're providing, the AI can roughly communicate, here is what, based upon what you shared, you likely know and are able to do. And that individual can go and clean that information up, but they're not starting from scratch. And the output is going to be machine actionable data in the form of an LER. And while some might say I don't think this community would say it, but it's certainly come up in others, where like, is self-assertion good enough? Well, for me it is, because the vast majority of labor market transactions happening in the US context are self-assertions. We know how to work with that world. So let's not let perfect be the enemy of good. Let's just get some incremental value out there. And if people are able to, instead of producing a resume, produce a better described set of skills that are machine actionable, that's a huge step forward. And if Jason can do it, anybody can do it. And instead of saying, how do we start with universities and colleges and those college graduates coming out and giving them credentials, why don't we have an AI-enabled solution like this in every reemployment center in the United States? So instead of somebody coming in and saying, I've been dislocated from work, I want to re-enter the workforce, and them saying, okay, do you have a resume? Let's clean that up for you before we start searching for jobs. They say, let's generate for you an LER. And by the way, we're going to use this AI tool to help you better describe what you know and are able to do, and it's going to be data on the back end that could then be used to apply for a job. So that was kind of what brought us into the discussion, but it was an idea. And we went out there, we found a funder, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who came forward and said, this is intriguing to us. And folks said, is it going to work? And I said, I have no idea. It's a crazy idea, but I remember I first was joking with some of our other consultants. I'm like, Phil Long's going to hate this idea. And turns out I shared it with him and he loved it. So I thought, okay, we definitely got to be onto something if Phil likes it. So this was the test that we recently did. It was, can it be done? And how do we get a community of practice together that could test the concept out? So we're not just saying, of course it could be done, but saying, wouldn't it be pretty cool if we could pull this off? Now let's actually run some test use cases and see what we could learn from it. So that's what the panel is going to talk about, is what that experience was like, and then I'm happy to come back and talk about what comes next for the initiative.
Thank you. Phil, you want to do a slide? You have slides? Okay. I wanted to try to weave some threads in why I think this is relevant. This is a relevant experience for this community. First of all, because it talks about the agency that we have to self-recognize, and to do it through stuff that already exists about ourselves. Maybe files, documentation that we have, also credentials that is flat, that does not have structure. So the ability to take whatever already exists and turn that also into machine-readable data through some emerging technologies was great. You create structural records, we can call them open badges, or LERs, That was, at least back at the beginning of the year, a way to start to look at what the impact on recognition could be through the use of this technology. And clearly the conversation has evolved, and it will be more manifest when, say, Julie shares, what they've done, which I think is exactly, I remember having a conversation when Experience U came out, and we grouped up and said, okay, are we going to be able to do something with this or jump in? And that happened. So again, this is just an early way of how part of AI, not necessarily the generative aspect of it, but the ability to learn, to look at existing data and give it depth, meaning, richness, and turn it into machine readable, could be done in a way that is owned and has agency. Phil?
So I think just the practical requirements of people applying as teams to participate in this activity, we basically told them, you have unstructured data out there from any number of different sources. It may be paper things that somebody has, and they could scan and capture that into some sort of an image. You have you have opportunities to capture audio and translate that into something that the AI can work with. You may have records from PDFs from previous activities that you've done in some fashion, or you may have just simply the stories that you can tell about your experience. All of that needs to have some form of AI, whether that's a structured large language model, whether that is a series of machine NLP-based translation tools that then are submitted to another AI system entirely. We don't care. Figure out the one that makes sense for you. Bring that together, but the output has to be an LER that's generated in the form of either an OBV3 or a CLRV2, and that when you give that to us, we'll verify by going and do a conformance test on it and tell you that it is an interoperable representation of some sort of skills or capabilities from the community that you worked with. The amazing thing from our perspective is we had 12 teams come together. Most teams had more than 2 or 3 components or participating organizations. We had the Grant Gates Foundation, but it didn't go to them necessarily to underwrite the work or the cost. I want to make this very clear. We did pay and underwrite. They're coming to present their information at the end. We started in January of this past year. We actually really got started, that's when we announced it, then we really got started in February. They had to deliver this with a series of videos that described the elements that they went through and attestations from people involved in July. That was the timeline they had to work with. We had them meet on a weekly basis. We didn't require it. We just said we're going to have a community meeting every week. And from that, the teams that are going through this process, we want you to share openly the problems that you're having, the solutions that you've come up with to those problems, and solicit help from others in the community if you haven't figured something out and you're stuck. And to our surprise, frankly, every week we had something between 30 and 40 people attend representing these teams. And the conversations went on well beyond the hour that we aligned them to. And they wanted to come back and keep doing it each week. And this was, in addition to that, those of us that were technical advisors met with the individual teams. There's only 3 of us, so we met with the individual teams 3 a week. 3 different teams a week throughout the entire period of time, rotating through the 12. So there was a tremendous amount of engagement, of hands-on work, and one of the couple of surprising outcomes from my perspective, I thought the AI part would be one of the bigger challenges. It wasn't. That was the easy part, surprisingly. The hard part was writing the JSON LD, OBV3, and CLR2 credentials. That was the hard part because most of the developers just were not familiar with the semantic representation of data, and they just didn't. They may have been really good Python programmers, really objective-oriented language programmers. They had no clue about the actual semantics of using linked data to represent ideas and concepts. That was one of the surprising things. The other thing that was surprising was the diversity of the teams that emerged. We had groups from the military that were taking U.S. military records and turning those into LERs. We had people from a university that was taking PDFs of old transcripts and extracting skills by going through their history of syllabi for all of the courses. They had an algorithm which they built that if the person over the course of 4 years saw the same extracted concept of a skill or a capability appear more than 4 times, then maybe in the course of that 4 years they actually learned it. And so they pulled those out, ranked them, gave them back to the individual students and said, what do you think? You think you really know this from the time that you spent in this time in the 4 years there or not? And then they would add their ranking to it. Clever approach to that. And finally, we had the teams that were looking at at this point, marginalized populations that had very little in the way of formal anything to offer, and yet could express their capabilities through an interaction with a bot that would either be text-oriented or voice-oriented, and extract from that skills and capabilities, and take that and go out to a skill repository and do a comparison. This is what the AI says the skill is. Look, here's the repository for one of the, whether it's ONET or one of the other repositories out there. This is the best match we found. Bring it back to the person and say, does this sound like what you're telling us? And have them refine that process. So the result would then generate a conformant LER. And in fact, of the finalists that got through, 10 teams were able to do exactly that. One of those teams was one that Julie participated in, and I'd like to hand it to her.
Okay. So those who know me, I'm going to try not to just start this conversation midstream. I've been chatting with many of you. One thing that has struck me again about this morning was how many folks are saying we are issuing these badges, we're working in more marginalized communities. Samuel, if you're here in this room, I was particularly struck. Who has the power to tell their story? Who has the power to self-attest their skills? I agree, you do, I do, Phil does, many of us in this room do, but I also know Ashley and many other, and Crystal, who I work with very closely, and Mary Hayes work with populations who do not feel that they have any skills or anything to offer. So it is very true, the open recognition communities of practice, and there are many, and we hope that you join us on these calls. Our colleagues at We Are Open conduct these. We had this idea of what if people got to tell their own story and then map that onto a credential. So Crystal Rawls and I and Simone and actually Nate and many folks wrote this proposal to XBU. And then we joined a meeting and we met the most incredible Mary Hayes from Workbay. So Workbay has a platform. She's in probably 16 states, correctional facilities in those 16 states, very mature platform that sort of matches folks coming out of incarceration and transitioning into communities. They are able to go onto Workbay. They're able to train in various regionally based occupations, and then they're matched with employers who have generally joined into fair chance employment programs, right? They're not going to just shut these people out because they have a background record. So the problem that both Crystal and Mary have, a lot of female labor, to work with their marginalized populations and extract their superpowers. And it took so much work. For Mary, these are thousands of individuals. 600,000 people come out of incarceration in the US every year. And we know if they don't find meaningful employment within that first year, US recidivism rates are the worst in probably the world, really. So the critical need to get these humans into meaningful employment was real. So when we were on that first experience you call, I'm getting this back channel by this just unbelievable, and if you've met Mary, she is indefatigable. So she's emailing me basically like, I think this AI, this storytelling, this is what I need. It's taking me too long to extract these superpowers. I need folks to feel comfortable to tell their own story. And AI actually had an equity play here, because if you are in prisons, if you are not incarcerated, you have more power than that person, no matter who you are, right? If you're incarcerated, you're not on the same power level, right? So even if this is a benevolent actor, those conversations are hard, right? So the AI might allow you to tell your story in a way that feels more comfortable. But initially, the work is also, how do you have an AI that can elicit in a culturally responsive way? How do you then get a transcript? We know, I don't know who said it, if you don't sound like Dan Rather in the US, these transcripts will not be accurate, right? So that was the sort of project. Essentially, Workbay and basically the open recognition group, several of us, just got in there with Mary. Nate helped out in terms of the tech team around this issue of translating these into OB3. But then Mary went into prisons to start to train these bots. What is the sort of back and forth that you would want to have with someone in incarceration that would elicit that story? And then came the other challenge, and I'm curious from our European partners in Australia and also in South Africa, around taxonomies, because I remember talking to Phil in that ONET. I mean, this is another thing I'm curious about even for T3 and Lightcast. What are these work taxonomies? Some of them are old. They may not match the current market. So that was another issue. The other issue in incarceration, which I found incredible, I've learned so much over the last 6 months, it's worth all of our time, is that prisons would not endorse skills. So if you're incarcerated for 5 years and you were a cook, in California they're firefighting. These are serious competencies being developed. The prison system would not endorse that, meaning they would not actually say it happened. It was like a black box. So Mary, through Workbay and this project, are now working with correctional facilities to just say, yes, this happened. They don't have to say the person did a good job. They don't have to say they did a bad job. They just have to say they did the job. So that is where we are, where Mary, in terms of development, is going to start deploying the AI in sort of different correctional facilities. I think she's going to experiment in the state of Idaho because now she's currently using Whisper. I don't know if you're familiar with that tool, but it is a transcription tool that does better with different ways of speaking different languages. So the transcripts seem to be a little bit more valid. So the ethical considerations are still very significant. I am a little terrified, to be honest, because on one hand, we have a good equity play here. There's an AI bot. Someone can tell a story. No one's watching them. There may be some more comfort. They may feel that there's more privacy there, but there is not. So let's say someone tells a story about how they were a cook for their entire family, but then seeped into that story is a story about their sister or their uncle, and maybe that shouldn't be in there. So does that person then have the process to delete things in that transcript that they don't want mapped into a credential? And what is the process for that? There are a lot of low literacy rates. We've also heard that from a lot of projects. So in terms of reading over their transcriptions, making sure there's differentiated approaches when that self-attested story is then turned into a credential, really the right to be forgotten, which is something established in Europe, but is absolutely not established in the US, except maybe in California, and that may be dicey too. I don't know if that's even happening. So that is the story of Workbay, and we called it open opportunity, and we're going to sort of move forward. But again, these ethical considerations, I think we do need sort of the technical expertise to sort of put those things into action so that people have again, we would review the transcript, turn it into a credential, but then have some choices about that. So I'll turn it back.
I wonder how easy it is to pull up the video. Is the video submission, is that something that could be?
I can find it later.
Okay.
I will definitely pull that
All
up.
right.
Yeah, because I mean, one thing about that video submission. So it was wonderful to have the opportunity to go to the Chamber of Commerce in DC back in July, but really the most incredible story was really Stephanie, who came on stage, who had been in incarceration was actually going to had a sentence for 17 years in prison. She had been, when she got out of prison, finally, she actually met a parole officer who heard her story and said, well, you were trafficked. You are a victim. They expunged her record, and now she's the COO of Workbay. But it is her sort of insights into her story and what that actual community transitioning back into the community that gave a lot of insights into the project, and that's how we're going to sort of move forward.
Yeah, I'd also like to comment that the challenge is to do that in a way that technically worked. You can't, in most prisons, you can't put computers in the prisons. They don't have access to the internet if they have computers in the prison. They were able to embed the actual bot on a tablet distribute the tablet would interact and capture their spoken or written responses to prompts that the AI was providing from that tablet. And then they would bring that back. The prison would scan that to see if there's anything that they shouldn't be, from their perspective, out, and then hand it back to Workbay, who then extracted the information and then applied additional AI to pull out skills and abilities from the text that they translated. And then they could work with that as the crux of the core material for writing a credential. So just the number of steps you had to do to be able to accomplish this was non-trivial every step of the way. And the last thing I wanted to point out is that one of the things that really emerged for me in listening to the various projects is something I hadn't anticipated, but it was the metacognitive side of the process of hearing back what the person said they knew how to do in this different representation of that. In some sense, they were taking the language that the individual spoke in colloquial dialect and translating it into, if you will, no offense, business speak that would be readily understandable by an employer. And that process resulted in the individual recognizing that they didn't know they could do those things. They hadn't translated the fact that they worked in a kitchen to realize that they were actually ordering things and keeping track of stock and doing these other, they were not aware of those things as separate things. It was just doing the job in the kitchen. And that metacognitive recognition, one of the people that spoke at the event said changed their lives actually made them believe they knew how to do something.
And by the way, this is fundamentally what some of the sort of inspiring pedagogical philosophy for this community started from. So this is the self-reflection, the portfolio thinking that gave birth to what we're doing here. So we're going back and trying to leverage something that was so inspirational and then unfortunately has failed to go mainstream, and see maybe can technology enable to help us with that. In one of the things that I wanted to call out, and in thinking about this session was, so we spend a lot of time in trying to credential sense making, so understand what really we mean, what is the meaning of these credentials. We do that through standards, machine readable, specifications. But it's not about giving it a name or finding a common definition for micro-credentials, for example. But it's what is inside the data. And so if we can now have the aid of a tool that helps us with that sense-making, and it's more refined, it can connect out to resources, it understands the language of humans and is able to produce an output that is also machine-readable. So there's a tension between working on structuring data and all these specifications, and the other of having data that is flat. And so while AI feels like it's a solution, AI could potentially disrupt any of the work that is happening around standards. Like, why are you even bothering figuring out a set of metadata inside an open badge? It's like, AI is just gonna read through it. But in order to be able to train this system, we need to feed it machine-readable data. It's better. So that is kind of a good flywheel effect that we hope brings together sort of the semantics in which we've been working around this stuff on and the emerging technologies. And this is just a way of looking at how do we recognize stuff that already exists and make it visible. It's like a little bit of magic, make the invisible manifest from the stories of people into learning and employment records, open badges, whatever we want to call it. And so this certainly is one aspect of this conversation that I want to highlight. I wanted to do justice to Chris, who's not here, and also just hint at what was another example. So Experience was a great early sample of looking at, again, recognizing, making the invisible visible. But how might we do better at giving the agency of people that have now information, these structured credentials in their possession, and look out and sort of make better use or have more value out of them. And so this is where credentials that you may own that are verified or verifiable could hint you in the right directions, whether they're like further learning pathways or job opportunities. So could we look at verified data and say, hey, how about I'm going to help you write an application to a job, or I'm going to tell you that you may have the skills to go into this study program. And out of that, have that, so bringing the generative power of AI that was not really present here, and say, with this data that you have, now we can help you, we can assist you in your lifelong journey, in a sense. Jason, did you want to add something?
Yeah, one thing I was just going to expound on that I was thinking about as Phil and Julie were presenting was, part of what we're trying to do within the open recognition context is really give everybody potentially a set of tools that will allow them to express themselves, and for AI to help them express themselves better than perhaps they might have done it before. And how many times do we kind of put people through a variety of experiences and then say, all right, it's on you now to describe what you know and are able to do. You had this work-based learning experience. Now I know this community is trying to solve for a lot of that through badges and other means. But for a lot of folks, they just, I pull up my college transcript. It tells me the courses I took. It tells me my GPA. It doesn't tell me anything about my learning outcomes, at least for the colleges I went to. And let's make it easier for people. And it's not a silver bullet solution, but let's let technology work for the everyday man to say, how can I go out there and have technology assist me in better expressing myself and telling my story? And I will at least be able to kind of endorse myself and saying, this is how I would represent my skills and experience. And then this could then connect to other work that I had mentioned earlier, and then we had a session just before this around like link claims and endorsement, where instead of saying, I just need as many badges from as many people as possible, if I'm able to, as part of this overall strategy, self-assert with an AI assist, everything I know and are able to do, I can then go out and seek endorsements. So I don't need somebody to always necessarily issue a new record as much as saying, I'm asserting these 10 skills. Now, who can I go seek out to make a link claim or an endorsement for each of those skills to buttress the trust around my record? And it's again, this should not displace other mechanisms, but it should be part of the family of solutions. And that's what we're trying to get at. But I think a lot of these things could be synergistic. So that's something Phil and I had talked about is, if people are making these self-assertions, you can increase trust through link claims, but at least gives them the data to start with to then go out and say, okay, well, based upon this AI-assisted tool, I've made these claims about this past work experience, this past education experience. I could go back to those folks and ask them to further endorse these skills. And it's just a different way of looking at it.
Great, thank you. So let's go into questions mode, and then we can continue to reflect on it. We have about 20 minutes, right? Ashley, I raise her hand.
I think from a grassroots perspective, this is beautiful work. This opportunity to support people who particularly have been enfranchised or have been discouraged from recognition. My concern comes when we commodify it and it becomes more like a mass production of information or a mass production or an exploitation of their stories. How do we prevent, especially if we get to this point where we're going to verify or not verify their experience?
Yes.
So how do we ensure that we're not mass producing and commodifying someone's experience, and that we're not gatekeeping whether or not we're going to verify or unverify their trauma? And not going to gatekeep whether or not we're going to recognize their story as knowledge or not knowledge, and skill-worthy or not skill-worthy. There's a what?
There's a tension there, because from one side we want that, from the other side we don't.
I think from a grassroots perspective, it's beautiful work. Like one-on-one, taking a person and helping them through technology, because I've done that. I've done that with human trafficking survivors, where we're trying to you can't do that work as one person. You can't. So helping Crystal do this with AI is beautiful work. Like what you're doing, beautiful work. But how do we keep that as a grassroots or smaller, instead of commodifying and making it 6,000, 10,000, 20,000 people? And who owns that data? Who owns that story? And suddenly it's owned by an industry who's now going to verify or not verify someone's experience, and suddenly that person is more traumatized because their story is not skill-worthy. How do we prevent that from happening?
Okay.
It's a good design challenge.
This is definitely, yeah. And I do think, and I bored many people with my. Oh no, definitely not. 100%, I'm not. I may like put Carrie on the spot at some point. But one thing that we've talked about, I think, is about choice. So all of us have the choice to put out a resume. Last time I checked, like no one checked. I mean, certainly nobody checked George Santos's resume before he ran. But so I mean, let's like keep this at a level of there should always be trust. And I think Anna told that story too. Sometimes you're going to self-badge your experiences, and you're just going to trust her that happened. But you also may decide, yes, there are some of these claims I'm making where I would love if Laura endorsed it or if Doug endorsed it. I do think that making sure there is a level of agency in telling your story, owning your story, and then deciding what the story is that you're going to publicize. Some of it you may not, but if you're training folks in healthcare, there's going to be some of that story that you just described that they do want to share, that they do want endorsed, and that they do want to share with a potential future employer. And then there's some stuff that they want to own and keep private. But I do think no one has figured out the who owns the data. And I think hand-wringing about some Terminator future with AI masks the real dangers of AI, of bias in the system, of data privacy, which we've all been grappling with since large social media platforms sort of exploded this. So I think being very open and clear-eyed and constantly having this conversation, but also for the technologists in the room to sort of help figure this out. How are we going to sort of, if sort of Web 3.0 technologies is about individual control, all of it, then how do we really make sure and assert it and not be naive about the political context in which they are being deployed? Like, I don't know if somebody else has that.
So one of the speaking about these challenges, one of the things about using these enormous large language models, these things with billions of tokens that are being generated from the input that they're scraping around throughout the web on a daily basis, the likelihood that some of the things that are being expressed in the context of generating these skills and abilities and stuff itself getting on the web, in fact, essentially pollutes the data that is being used to train the AI in the first place. And there's been some really good mathematical modeling that shows the more that information generated through AI-assisted interactions is entered into the overall internet public domain in one fashion or another, the less the capability of those AIs will be in the future, and that it actually will collapse down to the point that the whole use of AI becomes non-existent. And this is one of the real concerns. And one of the things that has emerged from that is the notion that the bigger it gets, the better it gets, isn't necessarily true. And they're starting to build AI assistants with really, really small data sets and very curated, trained data sets to refine them from specific populations that are relevant to the community that this particular AI tool is to assist. So an example of that recently was published, ironically, in Science not too long ago, a couple of weeks, where someone took the hallucinatory capability of AIs. If you all remember what hallucinating AIs, generating stuff that's not true. Yes. And put it to good use. And the use that they put it to was there are drugs on the street that are constantly morphing and changing around fentanyl and BRAC and several of these other things. And the people that have to treat those who are exposed to that don't have any access to them until after the fact, when the people come to the hospital and they don't know what to do with them. So they took an AI tool, trained it on a very small data set around a particular drug pattern. Turns out you can serialize drug three-dimensional shapes. I didn't know that. And so they have their own JSON-LD version of a drug called Smile. And they were able to generate about 1,400 to 2,000 different versions of this particular drug, and they gave it to the AI to generate new ones based on the molecular behavior of these conformational characteristics of these drugs. And they came up with 50 possible new drugs that could be there, that the AI said could exist. And then they went out in the community and started sampling for them, and by taking spectrographic images of these things, putting that into the AI, and found that in fact there was a large number of these things that the AI predicted. so that the people can now begin to build treatment mechanisms for things that may exist before they're actually in the world. Now, that same concept can be applied to this circumstance with very narrow trained AIs for particular communities with very curated trained data sets to make them both more effective and contained in terms of the spread of that information inadvertently.
All right, thank you. So that means that hallucinating may lead to unexpected positive
This is
results.
Simone.
Sorry.
Simone's
So,
takeaway.
Julie has a question. Just by raising hands, how many other questions do we have? Okay, 1, 2, and 3. All right, so we have like 13 minutes. So if you can, get to the questions and yeah.
So, this is fascinating stuff, but I heard nothing about EI in your talk of AI. The human tendency, because when I look at recognition of learning and people with low skills who don't actually themselves, they can't speak to their credentials and learning. And if you look at the human mediation process of bringing it out, I remember a study we did with a public pool cleaner in South Africa about greening the environment. And we said to this guy, how do you use, greening stuff in your work? And he said, actually, I don't have any skills or anything. So we turned the question around and said, explain what you do on a day-to-day basis. And what was fascinating, he told us how he used the chemicals, how he dealt, the properties of the things he used. And there was so much learning in that. And I'm wondering if AI can only, and if it's not juxtaposed with EI, can do that work.
So not yet is the answer to that. So one thing I didn't mention in the project is that we tested these different protocols to have that conversation with folks that were both incarcerated and transitioning. And then Crystal went in and reframed all of the interviews. So initially, it was exactly that. And then Crystal's emotional intelligence did the same interview. So we interviewed the same 8 folks again, because we are kind of thinking the next stage of development is training the AI in a much more responsive way. Because what Mary first elicited from these folks was the same, I don't know anything, I don't do anything. Yes, maybe I was a cook, but I don't know anything, I don't do anything. So Crystal then reframed and did exactly what you said, and then elicited all these rich stories of skills. So that is, this like sort of more contained project to train AIs to do, again, because Crystal or a lot of these folks are only one of them, and to do it at scale, they just can't. So, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I'd say it's a both-and approach. Like I said, AI is not a silver bullet. It just says, can it play a role here? And I think we answered it through the demonstrations is yes. Now, how you choose to deploy it could look very differently in a lot of different contexts, a lot of different products, a lot of different populations. And I think for some, people can kind of just grab a tool, use it, they don't need any help, and they're going to be just fine. And I think with others, there's going to be more of an interaction with a counselor or some kind of assistant who's going to work with the tool with the person. And I think we're just saying it's a capability that's out there. It can add value to open recognition and credentialing. But how you choose to deploy it is going to depend on the use case and the population. And I think there's going to be lots of instances where it's not just you and AI, but it's you, AI, and somebody that's helping you. So I think it's a both-and approach.
All right, yeah. Firstly, thank you so much for the panel, and especially digging into, Julie, the case example that you and the team really led here. I'm curious about consent. When it comes to the use of AI in these circumstances, especially 1, unstructured data, 2, using it by which, especially with marginalized communities, underrepresented and excluded. Could each of you on the panel, including you, Simone, because I see you on the panel, not just a moderator, reflect on any insights or learning you have around consent or new kinds of consent-based models we might need to be bringing into the conversation when we're looking to use AI in our projects? Chris Simone
is now hallucinating Chris being on the stage.
No, I'm sorry. I don't have a reflection. I have the same question. So again, I think part of it is eliciting those questions, and I think we can take them away. So I don't know if.
Yeah, well, a part of that is to make sure that whatever the AI generates is presented back to the individual so they can hear and make some sort of sense from their own perspective about whether they think that represented what they said or not. And so that dynamic, that's a loop that has to be built into these things, which is not often thought about. They just take the AI output and says, well, that must be the extraction of it, and they'll compare it to other sorts of things, but not back to what the person actually felt, thought, and was trying to express. So I think that's a piece of it, and there's more to be done.
Yeah. All right, this is where I had a couple of project blow-ups, and one of them is when Crystal forced the team to do training with human subject review. So universities already have this in place. I'm assuming European universities. These are very strict protocols around consent, and it gets even more strict with children and folks incarcerated. They are specialized populations. So the U.S. university system has very clear guidelines for this. And so, but Mary didn't. I mean, she's a private company. I mean, she's a great actor. But in a prison system in the U.S. that is full of bad actors. So we forced the human subject review on the team, and so put those in place with the folks that were involved in this study. But it is a very good question at scale. If Mary all of a sudden deploys in 20 states, that's where, again, the commodification, commercialization pressure is on her. That's a lengthy process, and it's hard for private companies to get involved in those. It's very clear for universities.
Yeah, I'd just maybe state the obvious, which is, this project and experiment isn't generating those problems. It lives among them. Because we're already experiencing those problems today, whether it's the commodification of our data, if it's the lack of consent that's occurring. I mean, our data is everywhere. It's pretty bad where we're at right now. So I think we just got to think through these issues that perpetuate our lives, how they apply to new tools that are going to be generated through this R&D. So I don't think we necessarily have the answer. And Experience U, we specifically didn't go out and say, let's build an AI product. It was, let's put a challenge out there to the community and say, do others have products they could leverage right now, but deploy it in this particular use case? Which there are companies that were doing this, but they weren't producing a VC at the end of it. So that was the innovation they were adding. So that's what we wanted to test. But as we go forward, we are going to continue this project. And we are going to support a community practice that's going to do field deployment. And I think we're going to be asking those very questions about, for those that receive kind of this official backing and support, how are they managing questions around consent or commodification of data? So I think those are challenges to come. But we know they're there, and we're going to have to combat them much like we're all combating them in other areas. Thank you.
So I have a question that I'm almost shaking my head about, because I've been on the periphery of recognition of prior learning in post-secondary, had many frustrations with it. But and I haven't seen the full 4 hours of the demo of Experience U, so maybe there was an experiment about this. My question is, how can this revolutionize, disrupt in a good way, the recognition of prior learning for credit and the development of knowledge within higher education institutions? So in other words, they're not just judging whether this fits a program. Oh, that's new knowledge that our institution could use.
Things I think that was revealing about this process, and Case Western University was the one that was going back through essentially years and years worth of alumni records, where they went and asked the consent of the individuals, could I use your transcript, your course, the courses you took and the syllabi that were in them, et cetera, that led to the creation of the diploma, whatever the terminal degree was that you achieved. And one of the interesting things that emerged from this is, in some sense, how rich the data structures that we are now building with evidence and the ability to refer to outputs of what the individual generated to demonstrate their performance about things, and how paltry the historical record was in the educational collection of material they had. So they were able to generate a transcript CLR with various things in it, but it was vast. It was almost a document that was more full of white space than full of actual information. And so it sort of, in that sense, is a challenge back to the institution saying, you have the ability to have much, much richer data to describe what a person knows and can do, but it's not in anything you keep. It's thrown away in the LMS data that you get rid of every semester to deal with the next class. And there's nothing there that's going through that to try to extract anything that might be useful. What about actually describing what the person did?
So we really have just 2 minutes to go. I want to offer an opportunity for us to continue this conversation tomorrow. Chris had a session where he was going to talk about part of the sort of the downstream leverage of AI to tell better stories or just inform your pathways through a thing that is called Climb Up. If it's not going to be there, we can actually continue this because there's a lot to talk about. And there are 2 use cases that I'm really interested to explore. One is using the experience you approach, so turning unstructured data into structured credential data through AI with the Boy Scouts. Jeffrey and I just came from the World Education Scout Congress, and so that was great. The other is with refugees. And on the refugee side, I think the experience that you've done with Workbay is a great starting point, and UNESCO has an interest in starting a work stream around the use of AI and recognition for refugees. So that is an emergent thing that needs the contribution of this community and that we can shape together. So that does not have a shape, so maybe we can use that session to workshop some ideas out. Maybe go back to UNESCO and see if we can put the right guardrails to do this with communities that are very specific, that have requirements that, some of which we just elicited today. So again, there is a session called Climb Up tomorrow in the session, and if Chris doesn't make it, unfortunately, maybe we can still use that time to continue this conversation. I wanted to call out that Experience 2 as a phase 2, hopefully likely coming up. So if you have not done so, go back and watch all the showcase videos. They're short and great. But that's not it. So hopefully this is just going to be a flywheel effect. Thank you, panelists. Thank you for Experience 2. Thank you for the chat.